The old woman hadn't said a word in 6 years. Not to her doctors, not to her granddaughter, not even the night her husband died in the room beside her. The nursing home staff had stopped expecting anything different. Then a stranger walked in. Leather vest, tattooed arms, a Hell's Angels patch across his back, and the head nurse nearly called security. He sat down anyway, said nothing important, just talked, the way you'd talk to anyone. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, he showed her an old photograph. Her eyes changed, her lips moved, and after 6 years of silence, she said his father's name, a name that should have died 70 years ago. The Maple Grove Senior Care Home sat on the edge of Nashville, where the city's noise faded into quiet streets lined with oak trees and old brick houses. Inside, the hallways smelled of lavender cleaning spray and overcooked coffee. Room 114 belonged to Eleanor Whitfield, and for the past 6 years, no one had heard her speak a single word. The staff had grown used to it. Eleanor sat by her window most afternoons, watching the birds gather at a feeder someone had hung outside years ago before her silence began. She ate when food was placed in front of her. She nodded sometimes or shook her head. But her voice, the doctors said there was nothing physically wrong with it, had simply stopped. Diane Foster, the head nurse, had worked at Maple Grove for 11 years. She still remembered the Eleanor who used to hum old country songs while doing crossword puzzles in the common room. That woman had disappeared the same week Eleanor's husband, Harold Whitfield, passed away in his sleep in the room right next to hers. Grief specialists had visited. Psychiatrists had prescribed medications. Nothing worked. Eleanor's daughter had passed years before, so it was her granddaughter Grace who visited most Sundays, holding her grandmother's hand and talking about her week, her job, her small apartment near Vanderbilt, hoping for some flicker of response that never came. "She's just tired," Grace would tell herself on the drive home. "One day she'll come back to us." But 6 years was a long time to wait for someone to come back. That autumn, Maple Grove started a new volunteer program, pairing residents with people from the community who wanted to spend an afternoon reading, talking, or simply sitting with the elderly. Robert Hayes, the facility's director, had resisted the idea at first. Liability concerns, mostly, but donations were down, and a volunteer program looked good to the families deciding where to place their aging parents. The volunteers came from all over, retired teachers, church groups, high schoolers doing community service hours. And then, on a grey Tuesday morning, Marcus Coleman walked through the front doors. He was 47 years old, built like a man who'd spent his life working with his hands, with a greying beard, tattooed forearms visible beneath a leather vest that read Iron Riders MC across the back. He'd ridden his motorcycle the 12 miles from his garage in East Nashville, and the receptionist, a young woman named Patty, stared at him like he'd wandered in from the wrong building. "Can I help you?" she asked, her hand hovering near the phone. "I'm here for the volunteer thing," Marcus said. His voice was low and rough, but not unkind. "Saw the flyer at the diner on Gallatin. Said you needed people to visit folks." Patty glanced toward the office where Robert Hayes was reviewing paperwork. She hesitated, then picked up the phone. "Mr. Hayes, there's a gentleman here about the volunteer program." Robert Hayes came out a few minutes later, his tie a little crooked, his expression carefully neutral in the way of a man trying not to judge a book by its cover and failing anyway. He looked Marcus up and down, the vest, the tattoos, the silver rings on his fingers, and cleared his throat. "We usually get retirees, teachers, church volunteers," Robert said. "I've got 2 hands and a Tuesday off," Marcus replied. Figured that counted for something. Robert wasn't sure it did, not entirely, but turning away a volunteer felt like bad business, and worse karma. He handed Marcus a clipboard with a background check form. "Fill this out. We'll see." The background check came back clean. Surprisingly clean, Robert thought, given the leather and ink. No record beyond a couple of old traffic violations. Marcus Coleman ran a motorcycle repair shop, had for 20 years, and according to the reference he listed, sponsored a toy drive for foster kids every December. Still, when Robert assigned him a resident to visit, he didn't put Marcus with anyone fragile. He gave him Walter Higgins, a retired truck driver who liked talking about engines and could hold a conversation for hours about carburetors and cross-country routes. Safe. Predictable. Marcus visited Walter every Tuesday for 3 weeks, and the two men got along like old friends, trading stories about roads they'd traveled and machines they'd loved. But on the 4th Tuesday, Walter was in the hospital with pneumonia, and Marcus found himself standing in the hallway of Maple Grove with an empty afternoon and nowhere to be. That was when he saw her, the old woman by the window in room 114, sitting so still she might have been a photograph of herself. Something about the stillness caught him. He'd seen men go quiet like that after Vietnam, sitting in bars back when he was young, staring at nothing, carrying something too heavy for words. He recognized the shape of it, even if he didn't know her story. He knocked softly on the open door. "Mind if I sit a while?" Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't even turn her head, but she didn't tell him to leave either. Not that she could have, not with words. And Marcus took that as invitation enough. He pulled the visitor's chair a little closer and sat down, his big frame folding awkwardly into the small chair, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "Name's Marcus," he said eventually. "Marcus Coleman. Fix motorcycles for a living. Figured I'd keep you company if that's all right." The birds outside the window scattered from the feeder, startled by something unseen, and settled again. Eleanor's eyes followed them, but nothing in her face changed. Diane Foster passed by the open door and stopped, frowning at the sight of the leather-clad stranger sitting beside her most fragile resident. She made a note to speak with Robert Hayes about it. Some things, she thought, just didn't belong together. She had no idea how wrong she was. Marcus came back the next Tuesday and the one after that. He never asked Eleanor questions that required answers. He'd learned young that silence didn't always mean absence, and he wasn't about to push a woman who clearly needed room to breathe. Instead, he talked about his shop, about the motorcycle he was restoring, a 1978 Harley Shovelhead that had belonged to his father, about the weather, the traffic on Gallatin Pike, the argument he'd had with his supplier over the price of brake pads. Diane Foster watched from the hallway more often than she wanted to admit. She didn't trust it, a stranger, biker gear and all, sitting alone with a vulnerable elderly woman who couldn't call for help if something went wrong. She brought her concerns to Robert Hayes on a Thursday afternoon. "I don't like it," Diane said, arms crossed. "We don't know anything about this man beyond a background check, and Eleanor's family should be consulted before he spends more time with her." Robert rubbed his temples. He understood the concern. He'd had the same instinct on day one, but 3 weeks of clean visits, respectful behavior, and a man who signed in and out exactly on schedule had softened his suspicion somewhat. "I'll call Grace," he said. "Let her decide." Grace Whitfield arrived that Sunday, expecting to hear that her grandmother's routine had been disrupted by some inappropriate volunteer. Instead, she walked into room 114 and found Marcus sitting quietly beside Eleanor, reading aloud from a battered paperback western he'd brought from home, his deep voice rolling through the description of a dusty cattle drive. Eleanor's eyes were open, fixed somewhere in the middle distance, but her hands, Grace noticed this immediately, were folded in her lap instead of clenched into the tight fists that had become habitual since Harold's death. Marcus noticed Grace in the doorway and stopped reading, closing the book carefully around his finger to hold his place. "You must be the granddaughter. Eleanor talks about you." He caught himself, grimaced slightly. "Well, I mean, she doesn't talk, but there's pictures on the dresser, I figured." Grace almost smiled despite herself. "Grace," she said, extending a hand. "Marcus." His grip was firm but careful, a mechanic's hand, calloused and strong. "I hope it's all right, me sitting with her. Nobody told me not to." Grace studied him for a long moment. The tattoos, the vest, the kindness in his eyes that didn't match the intimidating exterior. And something in her chest loosened, a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. "It's more than all right," she said. "Nobody's gotten her to sit like this, so calm, in years." Over the following weeks, a rhythm formed. Marcus visited every Tuesday and Thursday now, sometimes bringing his lunch to eat beside Eleanor's window, sometimes bringing photographs of motorcycles he'd restored, holding them up so she could see, narrating the history of each machine like a proud father showing off his children. He never expected her to respond. That, Diane Foster began to realize, watching from a cautious distance, was precisely why it seemed to be working. Everyone else came to Eleanor, bracing for her silence, treating it like an obstacle to overcome. Marcus simply accepted it, and in accepting it, made space for something else to happen. Grace started staying longer on her Sunday visits, timing them sometimes to overlap with Marcus's Tuesday afternoons when his schedule shifted. She learned that Marcus had grown up rough, a father who drank too much, a mother who left when he was 9, a childhood spent bouncing between relatives, until he found the motorcycle club that became his real family at 19. He'd turned his life into something steady, a business, a home, a community of riders who, despite their fearsome reputation, spent more time raising money for sick kids and delivering groceries to shut-ins than anything the movies suggested. "People look at the vest and decide who I am before I say a word," Marcus told Grace one afternoon, while Eleanor dozed in her chair between them. "Kind of like how everybody looks at your grandmother and decides there's nobody home in there anymore. Maybe that's why I keep coming back. I know what it's like to be written off." Grace felt something shift in her understanding, not just of Marcus, but of the assumptions she hadn't realized she'd been making about people like him her whole life. It was on a Thursday in late October, 6 weeks into his visits, that Marcus brought something different, an old photograph, creased and faded, of a young man in an army uniform standing beside a motorcycle, squinting into the sun outside what looked like a diner. "That's my dad," Marcus said, settling into the chair. "Elijah Coleman. Served in Korea, came home, never really talked about it. Died when I was 22. Found this in a box after he passed. Figured I'd bring it since we've been talking about the old days so much." He held the photograph up toward the window light so Eleanor could see it clearly, expecting nothing, as always. But this time, Eleanor's head turned. Slowly, deliberately, for the first time in 6 years, she looked directly at something someone had shown her, not past it, not through it, but at it. And her eyes fixed on the photograph with an intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. Marcus went very still. "Eleanor," her lips parted. For a long moment, nothing came out. Just breath, just the shape of a word trying to remember how to exist. Then, hoarse and cracked from years of disuse, barely above a whisper, Eleanor Whitfield spoke. "Elijah." The word hung in the room like something fragile that might shatter if anyone breathed too hard. Marcus sat frozen, the photograph still in his outstretched hand, his mind racing to catch up with what he'd just heard. You know that name," he managed. Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on the photograph, and slowly her hand rose, trembling, unsteady, unused to movement after years of stillness, and touched the edge of the picture with 2 fingers, as though confirming it was real. "Elijah," she whispered again. And this time, a tear slid down the deep lines of her cheek. Marcus didn't know what to do. Some instinct told him not to press, not to bombard her with questions after 6 years of silence. But his heart was pounding with a question he couldn't hold back. "Did you know him? My father?" Eleanor's gaze finally lifted from the photograph to Marcus's face, and for the first time she seemed to truly see him, not as a stranger in a leather vest, but as someone connected to a thread of her own history that had been buried for decades. Her mouth worked silently for a moment before she managed one more word. Dinah. It wasn't much. It was everything. Marcus called Grace that evening, his voice unsteady in a way that surprised him. A man who'd faced down bar fights and highway accidents without flinching, shaken by 2 whispered words from an old woman. Grace arrived at Maple Grove within the hour, and together she and Marcus sat with Eleanor, gently, patiently, trying to understand. It was Diane Foster, oddly enough, who provided the next piece. She'd overheard the commotion, and setting aside her earlier suspicions, pulled Eleanor's intake file from years ago. Information gathered when Eleanor first arrived at Maple Grove, family history recorded by a social worker before the silence began. There was a mention, buried in a paragraph, about Eleanor's early life in Nashville. Before marrying Harold Whitfield, Eleanor had worked as a waitress at a diner on Gallatin Pike in the early 1950s, the same diner, Marcus realized with a jolt, where his father's photograph had been taken. Over the following days, with agonizing slowness, more fragments emerged. Eleanor couldn't speak in full sentences. The years of silence had not simply lifted like a curtain, but single words came, painstakingly, precious as gold. Soldier. Kind. Left. Grace, sensing there was a story here that mattered deeply to her grandmother, began researching. She visited the Metro Nashville Library, searched old newspaper archives, and found a small announcement from 1953. Elijah Coleman, recently returned from military service, had been employed briefly at Rosalie's Diner on Gallatin Pike before enlisting again and shipping out. There was no mention of Eleanor by name, but the timeline matched perfectly. Marcus, meanwhile, dug through the box of his father's old belongings he'd kept in his garage attic for over 2 decades, untouched since the funeral. Beneath letters and old tools, he found a small tin box, rusted at the edges, containing a handful of photographs and a single folded letter. The ink faded almost to nothing. He brought it to Maple Grove on a Tuesday, his hands unsteady as he unfolded the fragile paper in front of Eleanor. The letter was addressed simply, to E. It spoke of a young soldier grateful for a kindness he hadn't expected, a waitress who'd fed him a meal he couldn't pay for, who'd sat with him on his worst night, listening to things he couldn't say to anyone else, before he shipped back out to a war that would change him forever. It ended with a promise to return and thank her properly. He never had the chance. Elijah Coleman was wounded within months, and though he survived and came home eventually years later to a different city, a different life, he apparently never made it back to that diner. Or if he had, he'd found it changed or Eleanor gone, married by then to Harold Whitfield. Eleanor listened to the letter read aloud in Marcus's rough voice, tears streaming freely now. And though she still couldn't form complete sentences, something in her posture had changed entirely. She reached out and gripped Marcus's hand, the first deliberate, sustained physical contact she'd initiated with anyone in 6 years, and held on as though she were holding on to Elijah himself, one final time, through his son. Robert Hayes, informed of the breakthrough, stood in the doorway with Diane Foster, both of them watching in stunned silence. "I was ready to pull his volunteer clearance," Diane admitted quietly. "I judged him the second he walked through the door." "We both did," Robert said. The story that unfolded over the following weeks was more complicated and more human than anyone had expected. Eleanor, with the patient help of a speech therapist Grace arranged, a specialist who worked with stroke and trauma patients on recovering language after long silence, slowly began piecing together sentences again. It was grueling work, punctuated by frustration and tears, but Marcus's continued presence seemed to anchor her, giving her a reason to keep pushing through the difficulty. What emerged, fragment by fragment, session by session, was this. In 1953, A young Eleanor, then unmarried and working double shifts at Rosalie's diner to support her widowed mother, had met a soldier named Elijah Coleman on the worst night of his young life. He'd just received word that his best friend from basic training had been killed overseas, and he'd walked into the diner near closing time, hollow-eyed and unable to afford the meal he desperately needed. Eleanor had fed him anyway, sat with him for hours after her shift ended, listened to him talk about fear and guilt and the strange shame of surviving when others didn't. They'd talked until sunrise. He'd shipped out 3 days later. They wrote letters for months. Eleanor produced, from an old cedar chest Grace retrieved from storage, a small bundle of correspondence tied with ribbon. Letters from a soldier she'd never told her family about, never told Harold about, never told anyone about in 70 years. The letters stopped abruptly when Elijah was wounded and hospitalized. Communication broke down amid military bureaucracy and the chaos of war, and by the time he recovered enough to write again, Eleanor had received a telegram. Mistakenly, as it turned out, meant for a different family, indicating Elijah Coleman had died of his injuries. Grieving a man she'd known for a matter of days, but who had somehow marked her more deeply than she could explain even to herself, Eleanor had eventually accepted Harold Whitfield's courtship, married him within the year, and built a full, genuine life with him. 46 years of marriage, children, grandchildren, a life she didn't regret. But she'd never forgotten Elijah. Never learned the telegram had been an error, never known he'd survived, married someone else, and lived out his own life just a few miles away in the same city, equally unaware that she hadn't perished in the influenza outbreak that had, in fact, claimed her mother that same year, and which he'd somehow confused with news of Eleanor herself, second-hand rumor twisted through wartime chaos into false certainty. Two people, each mourning the other based on false information, had spent 7 decades living separate lives in the same city, never crossing paths again, until their children's paths crossed by accident in a nursing home hallway. When Harold died 6 years ago, something in Eleanor had broken in a way grief alone couldn't fully explain. Grace, piecing together the timeline with Marcus, began to understand. Harold's death had reopened a wound Eleanor had never truly healed. Not disloyalty to Harold, whom she'd loved genuinely, but a resurfacing of the young woman she'd been, the loss she'd buried to move forward. The wartime sweetheart she'd never gotten to grieve properly because she'd believed she had no right to grieve him more than a stranger, more than a passing kindness, when she had a husband's death to mourn instead. The silence, the therapist explained gently to Marcus and Grace, may have been Eleanor's mind's way of holding 2 griefs at once, one she was allowed to express, and one she'd never permitted herself to acknowledge at all, until a stranger walked into her room, carrying the face and the name of the boy she'd fed on the worst night of his life. She wasn't broken, the therapist said. She was carrying something too big to speak. For too long, alone. Marcus sat with this knowledge heavily. His father, he now understood, had spent his whole life restless in a way Marcus had never fully understood. A hard man to know, prone to long silences of his own, staring off at nothing some evenings with an expression Marcus now recognized as grief he'd never named. Elijah Coleman had married, had a family, lived a full life, but some part of him, Marcus now suspected, had never stopped wondering about the girl in the diner who vanished from his life without explanation. "He used to say something when I was a kid," Marcus told Grace one evening, both of them sitting in the Maple Grove courtyard while Eleanor napped inside, "that everybody's got one road they didn't take, and the smart ones make peace with it. I always figured he meant something about his career. Maybe he meant her." By December, Eleanor could speak in full sentences again, though her voice remained soft, careful, as if she were still relearning how much of herself she was allowed to share with the world. She never fully explained why the silence had lasted 6 years rather than lifting sooner. Some griefs, the therapist reminded them, don't follow logical timelines. But everyone around her recognized that something essential had been restored. Not just her voice, but her presence, her participation in her own life. Grace visited more often now, and their conversations, once one-sided, became rich with memory. Eleanor telling stories about her early years in Nashville, about Harold, about the marriage she genuinely cherished, and eventually, gently, about the soldier in the diner and the peace she'd finally found in learning he'd lived a full life too, that neither of them had truly been abandoned by the other, only separated by chaos and error neither could have prevented. Marcus continued his Tuesday and Thursday visits, though the dynamic had shifted from stranger and volunteer to something closer to family. He brought Eleanor small gifts sometimes, a photograph he'd had restored, a recording he'd made of himself reading more of the westerns she'd come to enjoy, a promise that he'd take her for a ride around the parking lot on his motorcycle sidecar once the weather warmed, an idea that made Eleanor laugh, actually laugh, a sound Grace hadn't heard in over 6 years, bright and startling and wonderful. Diane Foster became one of Marcus's strongest advocates within the facility, publicly acknowledging to other staff how wrong her initial judgment had been. "I saw the vest and the tattoos and decided I knew everything about him," she told a newer nurse during orientation that winter. "Turned out he understood something about grief and patience that none of us professionals had figured out in 6 years of trying." Robert Hayes expanded the volunteer program that spring, specifically encouraging outreach to community groups he might have overlooked before. Motorcycle clubs, veteran organizations, groups whose appearance didn't always match the polished image he'd previously associated with appropriate volunteers. He often told the story, with Marcus and Eleanor's permission, during volunteer orientations, how a Hell's Angel and a silent old woman had taught an entire nursing home staff something about the danger of judging a person's heart by their appearance. Marcus's motorcycle club, the Iron Riders, learned the story too, and something in it resonated deeply within the community of riders who'd spent their own lives being misjudged by strangers who saw only leather and ink and made assumptions about danger and character. That spring, a dozen members of the Iron Riders rode out to Maple Grove on a warm Saturday, engines rumbling through the quiet streets, and gathered in the courtyard to meet Eleanor properly. Gruff, tattooed men and women, who turned out to be remarkably gentle, with an elderly woman who'd captured their friend's heart with 2 whispered words months before. Eleanor, seated in a wheelchair Grace had wheeled outside for the occasion, looked at the assembled riders, their motorcycles gleaming in neat rows along the courtyard's edge, and smiled. "Elijah would have liked this," she said, her voice stronger now than it had been in years. "He always said the road brought people together that nothing else could." Marcus knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her weathered hand in his. "I think he found his way back to you, in a roundabout kind of way," he said. "Took him a while, took his son even longer, but we made it." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with tears that no longer carried only grief, but something gentler, gratitude perhaps, or the particular piece of a wound finally, truly closing after 70 years. "Thank you for sitting beside me," she said, "even when I couldn't say why it mattered." "Wasn't hard," Marcus said. "Some things you just know matter, even in silence." That evening, as the Iron Rider's engines faded into the distance and the Tennessee sky turned soft shades of orange and violet over Maple Grove, Grace stood at the window of her grandmother's room, watching Eleanor drift toward a peaceful sleep, more settled than she'd seen her in years. "You okay?" Marcus asked, pausing in the doorway on his way out. "I keep thinking about how close we came to never knowing any of this," Grace said. "If Walter hadn't gotten sick that Tuesday, if you hadn't wandered into her room." Marcus considered this for a moment, his eyes soft with something like wonder. "Guess some roads find you," he said, "whether you're looking for them or not." He left quietly, his boots echoing down the hallway, past Diane Foster at the nurse's station, who nodded at him now with genuine warmth. Past Robert Hayes's office, where a new volunteer intake form sat prominently on the desk, redesigned that year to welcome exactly the kind of applicant the old form might have discouraged. Eleanor Whitfield slept peacefully that night, and many nights after, no longer carrying alone the weight of a grief she'd never been permitted to name. And every Tuesday and Thursday afterward, without fail, a Hell's Angel with a greying beard and a gentle heart pulled his motorcycle into the Maple Grove parking lot, walked past a front desk that no longer stared at him with suspicion, and sat beside the woman who had once been silent simply because all those months ago some things, a name, a kindness, a road not taken, had mattered enough to wait 70 years to be spoken.